She believed she was about to dismiss a nobody, but in that very moment, she had already sealed her own humiliation. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe dignity matters, stay with this story, because what happened next changed everything. The ballroom shimmered under towering crystal chandeliers, light scattering across marble floors polished to a mirror shine, where silk gowns brushed softly and tailored tuxedos moved with quiet authority. Glasses of champagne, catching golden reflections as laughter floated effortlessly through the air, a room built for those who belonged, or at least those who believed they did. And then the doors opened. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift, but somehow the air changed. Caleb Brooks stepped inside, boots worn from years on open land, denim faded under the glow of a world that had never expected him, his hat casting a shadow across steady eyes that didn't search for approval, didn't hesitate, didn't rush. He walked in like a man who understood silence better than noise. Conversations didn't stop all at once, but they thinned, stretched, bent around him as eyes flickered, glances exchanged, judgments formed in seconds, the kind of judgments people never say out loud but were plainly across their faces. No one stepped forward. No handshake. No welcome. Just space, widening subtly as if the room itself decided he didn't fit. Near the center, Eleanor Whitmore stood beneath the brightest light, her emerald blue gown flowing like water, her posture effortless, her presence commanding attention without asking for it. A woman who had built her identity on being exactly where she belonged. She noticed him instantly. Of course she did. Her eyes moved over him once, slowly, precisely, measuring, categorizing, dismissing. A faint smile formed, not warm, not kind, but practiced, the kind reserved for moments when someone needed to be reminded of their place. She stepped forward, heels clicking against marble, each step deliberate, the room subtly aligning behind her authority, and when she stopped a few feet from him, the silence deepened. Anticipation tightening like a held breath. "I think you're in the wrong place," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, carrying just far enough for others to hear, just sharp enough to cut. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through nearby guests, a few smirks, a turned shoulder, a glance quickly hidden behind a glass. Caleb didn't respond. Not immediately. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if her words had passed through him without leaving a mark. And that stillness, that refusal to react, unsettled something no one in that room could yet explain. The room didn't know it yet, but in that silence, everything had already begun to shift. The faint laughter did not fade right away. It lingered like perfume in the air, subtle but unmistakable, carried by those who felt safe standing behind Eleanor Whitmore's confidence. And she noticed it. Of course she did, because she had spent years mastering rooms like this, shaping reactions with nothing more than tone and posture, and right now the room was following her lead exactly as expected. She tilted her head slightly, studying Caleb more closely, as if searching for any sign that he understood the message, that he would apologize, retreat, correct his mistake, and disappear quietly like so many others before him. But he did not move. His hands rested calmly at his sides, his boots planted firmly against the marble, as though the polished floor beneath him belonged to him just as much as it did to anyone else in that room. And that stillness began to stretch longer than comfort allowed. Eleanor's smile tightened just enough for those nearest to notice, a nearly invisible crack in her composure, and she let out a soft, controlled breath before speaking again, this time with a sharper edge hidden beneath her elegance. "This is a private event," she continued, her voice carrying a little further now, inviting more attention, more witnesses, invitation only. A few guests nodded subtly, reinforcing the invisible line she had drawn, while others leaned in, curious, sensing something unfolding that might entertain them for a moment before the night returned to its polished routine. A man near the bar whispered something to his companion, and they both glanced toward Caleb with quiet amusement, as though they were watching a scene they had already decided the ending to. Still, Caleb said nothing. His eyes moved slowly across the room, not in defiance, not in confusion, but with a quiet awareness that seemed to absorb every detail, every face, every shifting posture, and for a brief second, Something about that gaze unsettled a few of the staff standing along the edges of the room. One server hesitated mid-step, her tray hovering slightly as she looked at him again, this time with uncertainty rather than dismissal, as if trying to place a memory she could not quite reach. Eleanor noticed the hesitation too, and it irritated her more than she expected. Control in a room like this was delicate, and even the smallest disruption could ripple further than intended. She took one step closer, closing the distance between herself and Caleb, her heels echoing with precision, and lowered her voice just enough to make it feel personal, while still allowing those nearby to listen. "If you need assistance," she said, her words carefully chosen, "the service entrance is around the corner." This time, a few more guests smiled openly, the suggestion clear, the message unmistakable, and yet Caleb remained exactly as he was, unmoved, unbothered, his silence now carrying more weight than any response could have. And somewhere in the room, almost imperceptibly, the energy shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that one or two people began to look at him not with amusement, but with something closer to uncertainty, as if the story they thought they were watching was no longer following the script they had expected. The smiles did not disappear, but they began to lose their certainty, like a joke that lingered too long without a punchline, and Eleanor Whitmore felt it before she could fully understand it, that subtle shift in the room that she had always controlled so effortlessly. She straightened slightly, her posture sharpening as if correcting an imbalance no one else had the authority to notice, and for a brief moment, her eyes searched Caleb's face again, not just to judge this time, but to understand why he had not reacted the way every other person would have. Most people, when placed under this kind of quiet pressure, would adjust themselves, apologize, explain, or leave. They would show some sign of discomfort, some acknowledgement that they had stepped into a space that did not belong to them. But Caleb Brooks did none of that. His gaze remained calm, steady, almost patient, as though he had seen this exact moment unfold more times than anyone in that room could imagine. He slowly reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, not as a gesture of defense, but as a simple, natural motion, the kind that belonged to him no matter where he stood, and that small movement drew more attention than any argument could have. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement fading into something less defined, while others glanced toward Eleanor, waiting for her to restore the balance they trusted her to maintain. She took another measured step closer, now standing just a few feet away, close enough to make the encounter feel personal, unavoidable, final. "I will say this once more," she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a sharper precision, each word placed carefully. "This event is not open to the public." The statement hung in the air, firm, controlled, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Near the edge of the room, one of the senior staff members, a man who had worked events in that building for over 15 years, paused as he looked directly at Caleb, his expression shifting in a way that did not go unnoticed. It was not recognition yet, not fully, but something close to it, something that made him straighten slightly, as if instinct had whispered a warning before logic could catch up. Another server followed his gaze, then another, their attention no longer casual, no longer dismissive. Eleanor noticed the shift again, and this time it was impossible to ignore. Control was slipping, not dramatically, not loudly, but in quiet, almost invisible ways that unsettled her more than open defiance ever could. She held her ground, refusing to let that uncertainty show, but for the first time that evening, her confidence met something it could not immediately overpower. And Caleb, standing in the center of it all, remained exactly as he had been from the moment he walked in, calm, composed, and completely unshaken, as if he was waiting for the room to catch up to a truth he already understood. The silence no longer felt accidental. It felt intentional, like the room itself had begun to hold its breath, waiting for something no one could yet name, and Eleanor Whitmore sensed it slipping further from her control with every passing second. She had built her reputation on moments like this, on the ability to define who belonged and who did not, and yet the man standing in front of her refused to play his part, refused to shrink, refused to give her the reaction that would end this cleanly. A faint crease formed between her brows before she smoothed it away, replacing it with a sharper composure, one that carried less patience, and more authority. "I do not think you understand," she said, her voice now firm enough to cut through the low murmurs that had begun to ripple across the ballroom. "This is not a place you can simply walk into." The words landed harder this time, deliberate, final, designed to leave no room for interpretation, and for a moment, it worked. A few guests nodded again, reassured by the familiar structure of her control, while others turned their attention fully toward the scene, no longer pretending not to watch. Caleb's expression did not change. If anything, there was something quieter now, something deeper behind his stillness, as though he had already heard every version of this conversation long before this night began. His eyes moved briefly, not toward Eleanor, but past her, scanning the room with a calm awareness that unsettled more than one person who met his gaze. Near the far side of the ballroom, a man in a dark suit who had been speaking with two investors suddenly paused mid-sentence, his attention locking onto Caleb with a flicker of recognition that came too quickly to ignore. He straightened instinctively, his posture shifting from casual to alert, and the subtle change did not go unnoticed by the staff around him. One of the event coordinators followed his line of sight, then another, their expressions tightening as if a quiet realization was beginning to spread, slow but unstoppable. Eleanor felt it before she saw it. The way attention was no longer anchored to her alone, the way the room was beginning to divide and focus, and that loss of center unsettled her more than anything Caleb had done. She took another step forward, closing the gap almost completely now, determined to end it before whatever was building could take shape. "I am asking you to leave," she said, each word measured, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge that demanded compliance. The statement hung in the air, heavy, expectant, waiting for the moment where he would finally yield. But Caleb did not move. Not a step, not a shift, not even a flicker of hesitation. And somewhere behind Eleanor, a voice began to rise, not loud yet, but clear enough to cut through the silence that had settled over the room. A voice that carried something unfamiliar in that space, something that sounded unmistakably like respect. The voice did not need to be loud to command attention. It carried through the room with a clarity that cut deeper than Eleanor Whitmore's authority ever had. And in that single moment, the balance shifted completely. "Mr. Brooks," the man said again, stepping forward now, his tone unmistakably respectful, his posture no longer casual but precise, deliberate, as though every movement suddenly mattered. Conversations that had once filled the ballroom vanished entirely, replaced by a silence so complete it felt almost physical, pressing in on every guest who had just moments ago been so certain of their place in the world. Eleanor did not turn immediately. For a fraction of a second, she held her position, as if refusing to acknowledge what she had just heard, as if the name itself could not possibly belong to the man standing in front of her. But the shift behind her was undeniable. She turned slowly, her composure still intact but now strained at the edges, and saw the man approaching, one of the event's primary organizers, someone whose opinion carried weight far beyond polite conversation. His eyes were fixed on Caleb, not with curiosity, not with confusion, but with recognition that left no room for doubt. "We have been expecting you," he continued, his voice steady, respectful in a way that immediately redefined the entire scene. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but powerful, as realization began to spread from one person to another, like a quiet current no one could stop. The guests who had stood closest to Caleb just moments before began to step back, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create space where there had been none, their earlier confidence dissolving into something far less certain. Eleanor felt it in real time, the way the room no longer aligned with her, the way attention shifted away from her control and toward a truth she had not anticipated. She turned back toward Caleb, her expression carefully composed, but there was a new tension beneath it now, something sharper, something less certain. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice still smooth, still controlled, but missing the absolute certainty it had carried before. Caleb finally moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a small shift as he lifted his gaze fully to meet hers, and in that simple moment, the distance between them felt entirely different. He did not smile. He did not speak right away. He simply looked at her, calm, steady, unshaken, and the weight of that silence was heavier than anything she had said to him. Around them, no one dared to interrupt, no one dared to laugh. No one even dared to move too quickly, because whatever this moment had become, it was no longer something they understood, and certainly not something they controlled. No one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because something in the room had quietly rearranged itself, something invisible yet undeniable, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor Whitmore felt it slipping beyond her reach. The man who had addressed Caleb now stood beside him, his posture firm, his expression composed, but there was no mistaking the shift in his tone, in his presence, in the way he now faced the room, as though correcting a mistake that should never have happened. "Mr. Brooks has been invited personally," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough weight to reach every corner without needing to rise, and the words landed with a force far greater than their volume. A few guests exchanged glances, confusion giving way to realization, while others lowered their eyes, suddenly aware of their own earlier reactions, their quiet laughter now echoing back in a way that felt far less comfortable. Eleanor remained still, her shoulders held in perfect alignment, her expression carefully controlled, but there was a subtle tension in the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, a detail so small that only those closest might have noticed, and even they would not have fully understood its meaning. "I was not aware," she began, her voice measured, choosing each word with precision, as though rebuilding control one sentence at a time, that there had been a change to the guest list. It was a graceful recovery, almost flawless, but it came a moment too late. Because now the room was no longer looking to her for direction. Their attention had shifted completely, drawn instead to the man she had dismissed, the man who had stood in silence while being judged, and who now stood at the center of a realization that none of them could undo. Caleb finally spoke. His voice was calm, low, and steady, carrying a quiet confidence that did not need to demand attention because it already had it. "There was no change," he said simply. The words were not sharp, not confrontational, but they carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation. He paused for a brief moment, not for effect, but because the room itself seemed to hold still around him, waiting. The invitation was always there. A hush followed, deeper than before, heavier, as if every person present understood that something far greater than a simple misunderstanding had just been revealed. Eleanor's gaze met his again, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal left, only the quiet realization that the ground beneath her certainty had shifted completely. Around them, the distance between Caleb and the rest of the room had grown, not because he had stepped away, but because everyone else had, instinctively, uncertainly, as if recognizing that the man they had judged so quickly was not standing where they thought he was at all. The words lingered longer than anyone expected, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable, and in that silence, something far deeper than embarrassment began to settle over the room. People who had been so certain just minutes ago now shifted their weight, adjusted their posture, avoided eye contact, as if distance alone could separate them from what they had just witnessed. The elegance of the evening had not disappeared, but it had cracked, just enough to reveal the truth beneath it, and that truth was not comfortable. Eleanor Whitmore stood perfectly still, her composure still intact on the surface, but the certainty that once defined her presence had begun to thin. She had built her identity on reading people instantly, on knowing exactly where they belonged, and yet she had been wrong, completely and publicly wrong, and there was no graceful way to undo that. Around her, a few guests began to quietly step aside, creating a clear path where there had once been resistance, their movements subtle but meaningful, as if the room itself was making space for something it had previously rejected. Caleb Brooks noticed it. Of course he did, but he did not acknowledge it with pride or satisfaction. He simply stood there, the same calm presence he had been from the moment he walked in, as though none of this had surprised him. The man beside him spoke again, this time addressing the room rather than Caleb, his voice measured, respectful, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Mr. Brooks is the primary partner behind tonight's foundation," he said, each word deliberate, each word landing with quiet impact. A ripple moved through the guests, sharper now, more immediate, as recognition replaced confusion, and with it came something far heavier than curiosity. realization, the kind that could not be ignored or softened. A woman near the front lowered her gaze, her earlier smile fading completely, while a man by the bar let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly as if trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Eleanor turned her attention back to Caleb, her expression carefully composed. But now there was no trace of dismissal, no hint of superiority, only the quiet awareness of the mistake she had made. "I see," she said softly, the words controlled but no longer commanding, no longer shaping the room the way they once had. Caleb met her gaze once more, steady, calm, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt less like power and more like perspective, a difference not in status, but in understanding. He did not need to say anything more. He did not need to explain himself or reclaim anything, because the room had already done that for him, shifting, correcting, revealing itself without his effort. And in that moment, the silence returned, not empty this time, but full, heavy with a lesson no one in that room would forget. No one rushed to speak, because no one quite knew how to recover from what had just unfolded, and the elegance of the evening now felt fragile, like something carefully constructed that had revealed a flaw too obvious to ignore. The music that had been playing softly in the background seemed distant now, almost irrelevant, as attention remained fixed on Caleb Brooks, the man who had walked in unnoticed and now stood at the center of a truth no one could deny. A few guests began to adjust their posture, straightening their jackets, smoothing their gowns, subtle attempts to restore dignity that had quietly slipped away moments earlier. The space around Caleb remained open, no longer because he was being excluded, but because no one was quite certain how close they should stand, how they should act, what tone they should take. Respect, once withheld, had arrived suddenly, but without instructions. Eleanor Whitmore stood in that silence, her presence still composed, still elegant, but changed in a way that could not be reversed. She lowered her glass slightly, her grip loosening just enough to reveal that the control she once carried so effortlessly had shifted into something more careful, more deliberate. "Mr. Brooks," she said, this time using his name fully, each syllable placed with intention, as though acknowledging a reality she could no longer avoid. There was no mockery in her voice now, no edge, only a quiet formality that felt entirely different from before. Around them, a few heads turned, listening more closely than they had at any other moment that evening. Caleb regarded her calmly, his expression unchanged, not cold, not warm, simply present, as if the moment did not require anything more from him than what he had already given. Eleanor took a breath, measured and controlled, and for the first time, there was a pause before she continued, not because she lacked words, but because she understood the weight of them now. "It appears," she said carefully, "that I misjudged the situation." The admission was subtle, restrained, but it carried more weight than any apology could have, because it was not offered easily. A ripple moved through the room again, quieter this time, not shock, but acknowledgement, as those watching understood what it meant for someone like Eleanor to say those words aloud. Caleb did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once, a small, respectful gesture, neither dismissive nor triumphant, and that response, or lack of response, settled something deeper in the room. Because there was no confrontation, no correction delivered with force, only a quiet acceptance that allowed the moment to exist exactly as it was. And in that stillness, something changed again, not in Caleb, but in everyone else, as they began to see not just who he was, but how he carried it, without noise, without demand, without needing the room to confirm what had always been true. The room did not return to what it had been before, because moments like this do not simply pass. They settle, they reshape, they leave something behind that cannot be ignored. And as the soft music slowly resumed in the background, it no longer carried the same lightness it once had. Conversations restarted, but quieter now, more measured, as if every word needed to be considered more carefully than before. Guests who had once stood confidently now moved with a subtle restraint, their earlier certainty replaced by a quiet awareness of how quickly perception could fail them. Caleb Brooks did not seek attention, did not move to reclaim the center of the room, did not demand acknowledgement or explanation. Instead, he simply turned slightly, acknowledging the man beside him with a small nod, then began to walk forward at an unhurried pace, his boots echoing softly against the marble floor, each step steady, grounded, completely unshaken by everything that had just unfolded. And as he moved, something remarkable happened. People stepped aside, not abruptly, not out of fear alone, but out of respect that had finally found its place, creating a path that had not existed when he first entered. No one spoke to stop him, no one questioned him, because now they understood that his presence had never been accidental. Eleanor Whitmore remained where she stood, watching as the space she once controlled adjusted without her direction, her expression composed but thoughtful, as if replaying every moment that had led to this one. She did not call out to him, did not attempt to correct or recover further, because she understood now that some moments are not meant to be fixed, only remembered. Caleb reached the center of the ballroom, where the light fell brightest, and for a brief moment, he paused, not to claim the space, but simply to exist within it, as though he had always belonged there. A few guests lowered their gaze as he passed. Others offered small nods of acknowledgement, gestures that spoke louder than any words they could have said. And then, just as quietly as he had arrived, he continued forward, leaving behind a room that had changed in ways it could not fully articulate. Because that night was never about power or wealth or status. It was about something far simpler and far more difficult to earn. And as the last echo of his footsteps faded into the distance, the room fell into a silence that carried